Will How to Train Your Dragon's live action remake be good? After years of experiencing animated films being turned into live action films, is How to Train Your Dragon doomed, or is there still some hope for it? Now, this is a question that I've had since the film was announced. I really was passionate and curious and also kind of confused on why this film was being created, because I really love How to Train Your Dragon. Having a story about a nerdy, bit of an outcast kind of character who is able to unite everyone around him and become a leader and be a respected champion of his people is something that resonated with me a lot as someone who, felt a bit nerdy growing up, who didn't necessarily feel like the classic archetype of masculinity growing up in Wisconsin, as someone who didn't play football or didn't hunt or do any of those things, as someone who just wanted to make movies in my bedroom. That is a character that meant a lot to me when I saw it play out. And How to Train Your Dragon gave me a completely new kind of perspective on what a great animated film can be outside of studios like Disney and Pixar. When I saw it, it was because I was given a recommendation to watch it from some of my other friends. And this was already when I was creating YouTube videos about Disney. And so I was watching this as an adult. I never had seen it growing up. But when I saw it, when you see Hiccup and Toothless flying for the first time, it's just one of those wonderful cinematic moments that has stuck with me ever since. And to this day, How to Train Your Dragon 2 is one of my favorite films of all time. And I think a big reason for that is because this world is so well crafted and built up. And it was all done by Dean Deblois. Now, obviously, there are so many people that are involved in the creation of an animated film, but Dean Deblois has been the director of every How to Train Your Dragon movie. Each aspect of all of the films in the original trilogy was overseen and championed by Dean Deblois. Now, if you don't know who he is outside of How to Train Your Dragon, the first thing he ever storyboarded at Disney, because he originally was working within Walt Disney Animation Studios, the first thing he ever storyboarded was Mulan leaving her parents behind. That montage was storyboarded originally by him and pretty much had no changes. That was the first thing he ever did for Disney. Now, after that, he became a storyman on Mulan permanently, and he went on to co-direct Lilo and Stitch. And so for me, Mulan, Lilo and Stitch were already films that I perceived as absolutely classic Disney films. Lilo and Stitch for me is right now my favorite Disney animated film of all time. So knowing that Dean Deblois then created this amazing trilogy after it, where again, it's this deeply personal story with amazing visuals and compelling world creation. There's so many aspects to How to Train Your Dragon's universe that are established to create just such a beautiful and compelling story. Now, the reason that I've felt kind of conflicted about whether or not I thought How to Train Your Dragon was going to be great is because Dean Deblois is directing the live action remake. Now, I've seen quotes from him stating that the reason that he stepped into this role to create this film was because the studio had a desire to create it. And he felt that this project was going to be moving forward. He needed to be a part of it. And honestly, I kind of respect that perspective, because now moving forward, any alterations to the live action story are going to be overseen by someone who truly understands the characters and the world. He has an understanding of the characters, where he took them, where the world makes sense to be altered, and shifted, and what aspects of the characters in the world need to stay consistent. I mean, he just has a deep understanding of how this world functions and the direction of where it all goes. And so I have a lot of faith in his ability to execute on a story, because all of the stories that he's led have made a big impact on me. But of course, the reality is that the con of Dean Deblois overseeing How to Train Your Dragon's live action remake is that it won't have a new perspective going into it. How to Train Your Dragon will not be reinterpreted in a significant way to the point where it will feel completely removed or inauthentic to the world that was originally created in the animated trilogy. And honestly, I'm kind of happy about that, but that also sort of feels like the purpose of retelling something, is that you are getting a new perspective into it. But potentially, Dean Deblois will be able to make alterations to the story and the characters that make sense for it, or could provide new context to the world. For example, throughout the trilogy, we got mysteries that were originally introduced that got to pay off later on. For example, the lack of Hiccup's mother existing in the original film meant that Hiccup's mother was able to be introduced and her backstory was able to be fleshed out in a meaningful way within the sequel. And maybe there are still mysteries that can be explored and showcased and can go deeper on within this live action remake. For example, I think about, where did Toothless come from? What did Toothless's childhood look like? Where were his parents? These are all things that never really got touched on. And honestly, I'm okay if those things are completely laid to rest. But those are the kind of questions that I think could be meaningfully showcased and understood and developed in this kind of live action remake. Because I think there would be a lot of interest in knowing, when did Toothless last interact with a Night Fury? Of course, the story is told through Hiccup's point of view, so it makes sense that some of those questions were never able to be answered. But again, those kind of questions I would only really want answered by someone like Dean Deblois, who understands this world, that I really only want the champion of the story in the world to expand upon it. I don't necessarily want new people coming in, because having a lack of continuity between tellings of a story can lead to a degradation of the integrity of the world. And a perfect example of that is Kung Fu Panda 4. None of the people that worked on the original trilogy of Kung Fu Panda worked on the fourth film. And so character moments, character arcs, different meanings or interpretations of what the lore meant and how Poe's story could continue were degraded in service of a different kind of creative vision. But that won't happen with How to Train Your Dragon because of Dean Deblois' oversight on the project. And so I appreciate that he's stepping in, even though the big issue is that it feels like, why is this even happening? That's really the downside to all of this, is that there's always the question of, why is the story being told at all? Because we already have How to Train Your Dragon. It came out years ago, but it's not even 2 generations removed. There's so little time between the original story coming out and this live action remake. And so regardless of how good the remake is, it's just too close to the original that it's going to feel, I don't know, that it feels tired. It feels very modern Hollywood. That it feels like we're just ripping the IP out of the things that we all care about and juicing it for however long we can possibly do it for. And that it just like, it can feel like that it's being done for corporate bottom lines and a desire to profit from our deep connection with the world instead of being motivated by an artistic vision. The thing is like, I'm not saying that I think we should have a How to Train Your Dragon 4, but it feels like that's how I often feel about these live action remakes, is that I would rather introduce new stories or new characters or expand the stories that already exist. I would rather go in that kind of direction, forge new ground, versus going back to retell stories that were just created. I mean, The Hidden World just came out 5 years ago. Like, and so the idea that we're already remaking the original movie in the trilogy just feels so wild and foreign. Regardless of how much passion and energy and just pure love for the subject go into the How to Train Your Dragon live action remake, they are always going to be plagued with the reality that the original film exists. And that's not their fault. The work that they're doing is just clouded by that reality. No matter how much we connect with this new Toothless, we'll think of the old one. No matter how great Toothless will eventually look flying through the sky in live action, we'll always be thinking about the animated film as well. And no matter how cool, like something like Toothless and Hiccup fighting the Queen of Dragons is going to look on screen, we're just always going to be thinking about the original. I'm hopeful that the live action remake will be able to stand on its own in a meaningful way and explore new mysteries and go in new directions. But I think for the most part, we're going to stay true to the original story. And in that case, I think we're going to be left longing for the Burke that we remember from the original animated films.